We're going to do part two of our discussion of finding God in turbulent times. We're going to look at the 1960s and 1970s, maybe even into the early 80s. Maybe. We'll see. Last time, of course, we talked a lot about civil rights and thinking about racial integration, desegregation issues related to that. Today we'll focus more on changes regarding women and changes regarding sexuality. And I'll talk a little bit about student activism as well. So, like last time, I'll try and set a broader picture in terms of the national story, and then I'll turn it over to Cordelia to talk about the church locally and nationally. That's where we're going to go. So we'll begin with women's rights and thinking about what are some of the changes going on in the 60s and 1970s related to women. And people often refer to this as second wave feminism, the idea of first wave feminism being the push for women to get the right to vote, which lasted from roughly the mid-19th century up until 1920. There are historians who don't like this idea of waves, but I'm not going to get into that controversy. But suffice to say that in the 60s we see a sort of reinvigoration of a push for women's rights that's often referred to as second wave feminism. And we point to one of the key events in ushering that in. Does anyone happen to know who this woman is? Betty Friedan, that's right. So this is Betty Friedan, who is a journalist and author of the book The Feminine Mystique. Has anyone read The Feminine Mystique? Okay, just a couple of hands here. The Feminine Mystique is published in 1963 and was a book that Friedan wrote on the basis of interviews that she did with a number of her classmates, former classmates, about their frustrations as suburban housewives. This was the era of the 1950s, of course, is the sort of real big era of the push into a suburban American lifestyle, and it's also an era in the 1950s when there's a lot of cultural norms, cultural values that are pushing women into a role as domestic caretakers, out of the workforce, back into the home, where men were supposed to be the breadwinners, and the ideal life was depicted as husband, wife, 2.5 kids, living in the suburbs, with the man at work and the woman staying at home to take care of the kids. And Friedan's book was revolutionary because she wrote about what she referred to as the problem that has no name. And it was a frustration that many women felt with that role in life. This idea that they had everything that they should want, everything that society told them they needed or wanted, but she found that lots of women felt trapped, they felt limited, and they couldn't talk about it because they seemed ungrateful, they seemed like they were aberrant or abnormal. And this book was really transformative because a lot of women began to realize they weren't alone in their frustrations, that it was okay to want to do something else besides this, that they wanted to use their higher education outside the home, that they wanted to get involved in public life in more significant ways. And just as a side note, this is one of those things historians talked about, and I've read about this, and it's fascinating. I've come across a number of people. I have students who do oral history projects for my U.S. history class, and on multiple occasions they've interviewed grandmothers and things of that sort, and women who have talked about reading this book and a light bulb going off in their head and really transforming them and deciding to go back to graduate school, deciding to, this really was a sort of pivotal moment. It's wild. So that ushers in an increased sense of a desire for activism. Women began to get involved in a whole host of ways. Betty Friedan was also the first president of a new group that's formed in 1966, the National Organization of Women, NOW. And NOW focuses largely on political, economic, educational access issues. So the National Organization of Women is very much focused on sort of women getting educational and professional opportunities on equitable terms. That's their big drive. But there begins to be some frustration with NOW because NOW is driven by middle-class, white, professional women. And other women, there's lots of women who would have loved to be suburban stay-at-home housewives who don't feel that this really connects to their sort of experiences as working-class women. And also that people feel that this is too conservative, it's too limited in its push. So what by 1968, we get the emergence of what's called women's liberation, and a variety of groups participate in women's liberation groups that are more expansive. They're not solely interested in educational, professional equality, but also trying to change cultural norms, trying to change social ideas about women. This, for example, anyone know where this is taking place? What's that? Not in California. There's a clue here. It is Atlantic City. And why is it in Atlantic City? The Miss America pageant. That's right. So this is women's liberation protesters at the Miss America pageant in 1968. And I realize it's hard for you to see, but this sign says, "All women are beautiful." This one says, "I'm already liberated." And this is the site, and this is the site of, don't have the picture, but the famous idea that women's livers were bra-burning, women's liberationists, comes from this event because one of the things that they put up was a freedom trash can where women were encouraged to deposit any sort of fashion things that were unhealthy and uncomfortable. They were supposed to deposit anything that made them feel sort of demeaned or otherwise, and that included pornography. All kinds of stuff gets dropped into this freedom trash can, including some bras. And the idea was, by the way, to set this stuff on fire, but the fire marshal was like, you can't set stuff on fire on a wooden boardwalk, right? This is a bad idea. So, no bras were actually burned, but that's where the term comes from. And women's liberation, just as a, again, just think about this. This is a different sort of idea than what NOW was pushing for, right? NOW is pushing for education, for job opportunities. Women's liberation is, again, pushing back against broader cultural standards, standards of sexuality, standards of appearance, dress, any number of things. So it's more expansive, and that transforms life in a whole host of ways. And one of the things that comes out of this as a kind of culmination is, by 1972, we get the passage of Title IX. And I don't know, what do we know about Title IX? What have we heard about Title IX? Anti-football, there you go. Okay, that's very interesting.
Equity in women's sports.
Equity in women's sports. This is real. It's interesting because Title IX, we often hear about Title IX in regards to either sports or cases of sexual assault. Those are the two kind of things that circulate. And sports is by far the most, sort of the one people know the most. Title IX actually, it does transform sports, but that's actually a kind of side note. The original intent of Title IX was to ensure that all students received equitable funding at schools and equitable access at schools that receive federal government funding. Sports is only part of that. The original real intent of Title IX was to prevent professional schools from having quotas on the number of women who are admitted to various programs. So for example, even as late as the early 1970s, there are medical schools that have quotas set up where only 10% of their student body in any given class is women, right? And similarly for law schools. So Title IX, in some ways, is a real nice combination of these two things, right? It's about educational and job access, and it transforms it, but it also, in the process, transforms some cultural ideas, because yes, now schools have to start funding sports programs and other clubs for women, and this was deeply unfair. Women students, a huge portion of their student fees went to athletic programs, and none of that money went back to them. I mean, the athletic budgets at the University of Alabama's athletic budget in 1972, the spending was about 0.5% for women's sports and 99.5% for men's sports, right? I mean, and literally, and again, women are paying in student fees, and none of that money is coming back to them. So, yes, it does transform sports, and of course, because I'm a graduate of North Carolina, I have to put up the most dominant sports program of the 80s and 90s, the UNC women's soccer team. Anyway, so that's a little bit about women's activism. I've gone too long already. Well, I'll be very quick here because we're not going to talk too much about this. It's worth noting, though, students in general begin to take up activism, of course, in the 1960s and into the early 1970s as well. This takes shape in a number of ways. This document, the Port Huron Statement, comes out in 1962. It is the articulation of a group called Students for a Democratic Society, the so-called New Left. To say New Left, these are non-communist but on the left side of the political spectrum, trying to articulate a new place for students and student activism in life. They're inspired by the civil rights movement to get more involved, and so students start to flex their sort of protest muscles. Civil rights helps spur that on, and of course what's the big issue that gets students involved in activism? Yeah, the Vietnam War, right. And by and large, American public opinion was on the side of the Vietnam War up until 1968 or so is when we start to see a shift there. But students are already protesting Vietnam before the general public is worried about Vietnam. So students by 1965, they're the ones who are going to serve. They're the ones who are going to be drafted and die in this war, potentially. But students are at the vanguard of protesting this, and this does engage students. It gets them more involved in activism than ever before. And of course, it comes with some tragic consequences, like the incident in Kent State in May 1970, when National Guardsmen opened fire on student protesters. 4 are killed, 9 are injured. Of the 4 students who were killed, 2 were participating in the protests, 2 were walking to classes, uninvolved, right? So this is an amazing, tragic moment here. Last thing I want to mention, Cordelia, I'm sorry. Okay, the last thing I want to mention is think about the gay rights movement, because this is also going on at the same time. Part of that push for traditional gender norms in the 1950s was a real affirmation, again, of that idea of sort of man and wife, 2.5 kids. That was not a very accommodating, welcoming climate for anybody who was gay. And in fact, to be gay in 1950s often meant accusations of being a communist. Why these things are linked, I don't know. But that's the sort of, any kind of aberrance, any kind of difference in this era. So it was a very difficult time. And the first moment that really speaks to a kind of gay rights movement in the United States comes in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn, which is in Greenwich Village, New York. It was a gay bar, and on a night in June of 1969, the police raided the bar, essentially arresting the patrons for being gay and in public. I mean, that's essentially what they were doing. And this had been a typical behavior of the police in New York, but on that night, some of the patrons began to resist, to fight back, and a crowd developed and began taunting the police officers, and 3 days of sort of riots emerged as a result of this. So sort of gay Americans sort of standing up for their rights and protesting this treatment, and it really kicks off, it's really the start of any kind of gay rights movement in the United States, and in fact, 1 year later to commemorate it, we get the first ever gay pride parade in New York City. And that's why in June in cities across the country we have gay pride parades that commemorate the Stonewall uprising. And this parade is a remarkably courageous thing. You watch interviews with people who participated. And this one guy talks about how it was really kind of a race. It was a run because they were so scared as they were walking down the streets of people going to attack them. Or they, but they participated in it, and it went off successfully. And of course, we commemorate that even today. There's been huge changes as a result. So just as a quick recap before I turn it over, and just to situate how all of this stuff is happening at roughly the same time, I put together a timeline off the top of my head, just to sort of highlight some of the major moments. Understand this is not all-encompassing. There's other stuff you could put in here, but it gives us a flavor of some of the things that are going on. So 1947, this will also come back to some of the stuff we talked about last time. Jackie Robinson signs with the Dodgers. 1948, we have the integration of U.S. military. 1954 gives us Brown versus Board of Education. The Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956, with Rosa Parks and the ascension of Martin Luther King Jr. 1960 gives us those Greensboro sit-ins. 1962, the Port Huron Statement that I just talked about. 1963, The Feminine Mystique is published. We get the Birmingham Campaign, with the letters from the Birmingham jail that we talked about last time, and we get the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. 1964, the Civil Rights Act. 1965, the Voting Rights Act. 1966, we have the founding of the National Organization of Women. We get the use of black power at a rally for the first time. 1968, women's liberations, protests of Miss America. We get the first Black Studies program created as a result of black power. 1969 gives us the Stonewall riots, gives us Woodstock, gives us the occupation of Alcatraz by Native American activists. So think about all these different groups that are agitating for change in the same time period. 1970 gives us the Kent State Massacre, also the first gay pride parade, and then finally, 1972, we have Title IX that's passed. So all in this relatively compact period of time, we have a number of groups agitating for change. We have profound social, political, legal change that's taking place. How does that affect the church? How does the church intersect with that? I turn the floor over to Cordelia.
Thank you, Greg, for covering so much ground, and I'll try and match you on that. So I'm going to talk about how this connects or doesn't connect with the church. Greg has obviously talked a lot about what we might call secular history, and I'm going to do sort of the sacred, if you like, but I think it's really important to explode that distinction as Christians. God doesn't have a division of secular history and sacred history, and neither do we in most of our lives. So, though we split it up like that, I think they really have all got to be seen together. I think it's also important not to denigrate the secular. We so often do in church, is sort of where all the bad stuff comes from. But the church has done very well out of secular history. We've got the Roman Empire and Constantine becoming a Christian. We need to get away from some of these false distinctions. And also we're a people, as Anglicans, who believe in revelation through scripture, tradition and reason. And everybody in their own era has to wrestle with those and make some sense of where God is in there, what it means to follow Jesus, and how do we connect our spiritual lives with the issues around us. I'm going to start talking about women. I hope to cover some other things, but if we get stuck there, we get stuck there today, and maybe we'll resume this at another point. So I'm going to talk about where the Episcopal Church was with women around 1970. And there's two things that spring to mind, all under the banner of exclusion. One, of course, is around governance. Before 1970, no women sit in General Convention. Women get a vote in this country in 1920, and then there's like a 50-year gap in the church. I've done a lot of comparative history with Episcopal churches, and what's so interesting to me is the British managed to get two aligned very quickly. So for once we're on the sort of progressive side of history, shall we say. Have to get that one in. And the other thing to say is a lot of parishes aren't allowing women on vestries in 1970. St James has been since the 1950s. But there's like a quota system where only 3 women can ever serve at one time, and the rest 9 people have to be men. It seems from what little research I've done about this so far as that's a suggestion that comes from the women of the time, so that bears some thinking about. And that's actually put into our bylaws in 1971. I'm not sure when it comes out, but I'll read that next bit of the minutes in the next few weeks. So that's a sort of history of exclusion. The other obvious area is around clergy and the historic orders of deacons, priests and bishops. There is an order called the Deaconesses, who came to be because of our friend Augustus Muhlenberg, but they're not equal to deacons. They have different roles, they're not ordained, they tend to be in teaching and nursing, that tends to be their ministry. And their numbers are falling off by 1970 because of the increasing secular opportunities for women outside the religious sphere, so they're going into other places. So women generally aren't perhaps visible, obviously, on a Sunday morning, or behind the scenes even in church life. Women aren't acolytes, they're generally not vergers, they're generally, if they're anywhere near the altar, they are as part of the altar guild. That's as close and as much as they're allowed to do. So that's sort of quite a negative view of women. But I also want to present another side of this history. In our history, there are lots of influential individual women. Some of these pictures will be familiar to you. Obviously, Harriet Lane Johnston, the niece of President Buchanan. She is very influential in the Episcopal Church. It's largely thanks to her that we have choir school at Washington National Cathedral, and she's a benefactor of lots of great work around the Smithsonian Art Collection and with Indian rights and health, as well as children's health in Baltimore at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. Mary Yates Smith is one of our local heroes, if you like. She starts the orphan asylum, as it's called, in the 19th century, which cares for children who have no parents. Interestingly, both these women do a lot of their work through money. These people tend to be affluent throughout our history, and usually they give them as donations in their will, so they are the last people surviving often in their families and get to decide when family assets go. So we have a number of notable women throughout our history. We also, in the 19th century, have a lot of women educationalists as well. This is Margaret Markey. She was a great friend of J.P. McCaskey. She taught in the local schools, but she was also involved in education at St. James. There are other women, especially we start parish visitors very early in this parish, around 1900, and we also have women who come and offer other sorts of ministry. This is Miss Ruby, as she was called. She was doing an MA at Lancaster Theological Seminary in the 50s, and we were part of her field work. And she maintained links with the parish long after she went back to Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it then became known. So we have a number of women who made quite an impact on our parish as individuals. But what really interests me is what's called the parallel church. Women's experience of church was very different from men's for all these reasons. Being excluded from traditional structures and positions of influence. Women found their own place in the church, setting up often women-only organisations, the most famous of which was what's called the Women's Auxiliary, which then became the Episcopal Church Women's organisation later in its history. And what made it really powerful was their focus was mission. They funded mission, teachers, education, healthcare, around the country and around the world. They were really crack sort of fundraisers, if you like, of the Episcopal Church. And not only did they give women agency at local level, they had a diocesan structure, they had a national structure, but they didn't directly influence General Convention. They had a sort of way in to do that by sort of having representatives provided by other people for them to serve on committees. So they were the great fundraisers. The Emery family produced 4 of the great leaders early on. I don't know much about the family. They were from New York. The father was a seafaring captain, which sounds rather romantic. But they all gave their lives to the church and fundraising, and they started the United Offering, which really still continues today, United Thank Offering. As I say, their influence was money, but this money was directed to women missionaries, so they were really about empowering women with a salary, with status, not quite in opposition to the rest, but definitely giving this sort of women's space to women. problem with that was, of course, they were excluded from the wider church in some ways, and the mission fields got considerably smaller as the 20th century went on because of the end of colonial rule in various parts of the world, and also because people got more keen on funding priests rather than women because they had a dual purpose. So a lot of money of the Episcopal Church went into funding clergy to go overseas because they could not only work Monday to Friday, they could also work on Sunday as it was seen. So as I say, fundraising was their sort of charism, and we see that in our own parish. The parish house that we're sitting in wouldn't be here today without the Women's Auxiliary. They were really the pioneers of pushing for a parish house and fundraising. The other organisation I'd like to talk about is, won't recognise this picture, but this was the founder of the King's Daughters, as it was called, at St James in 1901. And another powerful women's organisation, very much dedicated to prayer and service. What else are we going to say about this? And of course we've revived that in recent years, and I know some of you belong to this. So the women were, women's organisations were doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work in parishes. You know, they were running the fetes, the suppers, the caring for people, providing clothes and any financial support. So these are 4 sort of snapshots of women's organisations. 2 at the top are from the Women's Auxiliary. This is Daughters of the King. This one was taken. These ones at the top were taken in 1950. They're cooking the Christmas supper, as it was called, in the old kitchen. I think we've moved on a little bit with the kitchen from there, but others may know more than I do. And this was, as I say, the Daughters of the King. They're celebrating their Golden Jubilee in this picture, and this was obviously taken early in the 70s, but yes, gives us a flavour of the time. If you were at church in 1947 as a woman, you would have a whole range of organisations. These are the 2 sort of big ones, but there were, you know, the Dorcas Guild, which did a lot of sewing projects for poorer families at home and abroad. There were also lots of fellowship groups, and of course there was the Altar Guild. So that was sort of like the parallel church, if you like. These were a lot of the movers and shakers in a very particular context. But as the 60s went on and women began to feel that they were being excluded from other areas of church life, notably General Convention. So throughout the post-war period, there's a push for women to get the opportunity to serve, and that finally happens in 1970. In St James, we see our first woman church warden in 1971, so we're pretty early with all of that. And then, of course, what happens with these women's groups is perhaps the downside of liberation and equality is that a lot of these groups really come under pressure to survive. Women are going out to work more, there are more opportunities, and so we lose quite a lot of a really historic women's culture as a society, and I think that's something that needs to be put into the equation when we look at some of these changes. Well, I want to move on to women's ordination and all of that. So women become deacons in 1970, which means they're equal to male deacons, and theoretically could then go on and train to be a priest. But the church has problems rushing to that, and people are feeling very impatient by then. There's some votes that don't go sort of the right way in General Convention, and so a group decide that they're actually going to go ahead and be ordained, irrespective of where General Convention is. So in 1974, there are 11 women who sort of engage in an act of civil disobedience, if you like, in Philadelphia at the Church of the Advocate. And they find some retired clergy and bishops who will ordain them, and they go ahead and do that. Obviously, the wider church is very happy about this. Wherever they are on the women's issue, it's irregular at the very, very least. And so there's a lot of time spent trying to see how they could be brought back into the legal fold, and the church's position changed on ordination. So that finally happens in 76. What's so interesting is so many of these women are involved in civil rights movement, and obviously they're talking a similar sort of language about equality and human rights. And all these movements overlap, and I think Greg was alluding to that earlier on. What's so interesting is that the woman who carries the processional cross at the illegal ordination is Barbara Harris, who later becomes the first woman suffragan bishop in Massachusetts in the late 80s. So whenever you look at these photos, there's always people who are either involved in things in the past or are going to be involved in other movements later. St. James, again, was sort of early into women's ministry in the ordained area. This is a picture of Elizabeth Myers. I don't know if anyone who was around there recognises her. She came to us as a deacon and was waiting patiently to be ordained, and when the change came, she was ordained in 1977 as a priest. She was a graduate of Smith College and Episcopal Theological Seminary up in Massachusetts. Has spent her secular life as a teacher and counsellor in the secondary schools before going ahead to become a parish worker and then a priest. And as we all know, we've had a long tradition of having parishioners become deacons or priests from here. Mary Lou Brock was one of the first deacon here as a woman in 1983, and then Molly Stolbach in 1989. So a lot of barriers falling and lots of opportunities, but the last stronghold in St. James wasn't women's ordination, it was being an usher. As far as I can tell. We allowed a girl to carry the cross in 1971, we allowed women to minister at the altar in all sorts of capacities, but it took till 1989 for women to be ushers. And if anyone has any information on that, I'd be really fascinated to know why that was. You never know until you look into the minutes what you're going to find in the vestry, what the vestry's up to. So that's very much a quick tour of women in the Episcopal Church. The other thing that Greg alluded to is the whole campaign around gay rights and around sexual orientation. This is a really big issue for the Church for lots of obvious reasons that maybe we can talk about in questions. And really, for most people, it boils down to marriage equality and gay and lesbian people being in ordained leadership. So that sort of debate starts as soon as women are ordained, because one of the first women to be ordained is a lesbian woman. And so that issue is sort of baked into women's ordination, if you like. As you know, the Episcopal Church goes for sort of 30 years talking about the issue and slowly coming to an understanding about God's work in the world, moving towards a more inclusive church, and having all the theological debates that need to happen around the incorporation, full incorporation of gay and lesbian people into the Episcopal Church. This is obviously a picture of Jean Robinson, Bishop of New Hampshire, who obviously there's issues around, he becomes a bishop before the rest of the Anglican Communion is sort of ready for that development, and again we can talk more about that maybe in a few minutes. Marriage equality, as you know, that's a slow process both in the secular and the church world, but that eventually sort of 2015-16 onwards in the Episcopal Church, and that's something that St. James has been involved with, and before that we were involved in blessing of same-sex figurines and supporting them. Deb and Marge were there early on as pioneers in all this new life. I think I just quickly want to end this by just talking about the prayer book, because obviously that's the other big thing that's rumbling on in the Episcopal Church all through this, and not unrelated. As we know, how we pray is what we believe, and pressure comes in the 60s and 70s to change the prayer book, to update the language. There's a greater sense of inclusivity in various ways, and just wanting to have a book that's more appropriate to the end of the 20th, early 21st century than the last revision, which was earlier in the 20th century. One of the innovations of the prayer book is the whole idea of the baptism covenant. The idea has always been, as we know, statements and vows that people make, but it gets much more particular in the 79 prayer book. It's all about how we should support justice and peace and work. It's much more concentration on how faith should be lived out rather than sort of general statements about our prayer life and things like that. And that provides both some of the fuel for some of these changes, but it's a reflection of that justice and peace are part of the Episcopal Church's DNA and in baptism and need to be reflected in how we do things in the Episcopal Church. Obviously that's controversial. Some of you will know that people left St. James over this issue of prayer book, of getting rid of or not using regularly the 1662 or the 1928 language. And where we are today is a sort of, we try and have a little bit of everything and try and mine the riches of all the traditions here in 2019. So that's a very brief run through of where the Episcopal Church is in this story. It's an important part of the story. As people's spiritual lives are as important as their working lives and their political lives. Obviously, it's always an incomplete project, and I welcome your comments and thoughts going forward now. Thank you.